The darkness of the Pacific Ocean, 200 miles southeast of Tokyo, the Japanese merchant vessel Awa Maru cuts through the waves, her holds packed with precious oil from the Dutch East Indies. Captain Hamada checks his watch. 0347 hours, December 17, 1944. The ship's bridge is quiet except for the gentle hum of navigation equipment and the occasional creak of metal as the vessel rides the swells. In the engine room below, the steady thrum of diesels pushes the 11,000-ton ship toward home at a steady 12 knots. Chief Engineer Tanaka monitors the gauges carefully. This cargo of high-octane aviation fuel is desperately needed by the Imperial Navy, and every gallon that reaches Japan could mean the difference between mounting another offensive or watching helplessly as American forces close in on the home islands. What Captain Hamada doesn't know is that 2,000 yards to starboard, USS Queenfish has been tracking his ship for the past hour, her periscope barely breaking the surface as she maintains perfect position for an attack. Commander Charles Laughlin peers through the periscope, calculating distance, speed, and bearing with the precision of a mathematician. His torpedo data computer, a mechanical marvel of American engineering, processes the variables automatically. The target is large, valuable, and completely unaware of the death stalking beneath the waves. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. The torpedoes slice through the black water at 46 knots, their wake phosphorescent trails invisible in the darkness. 4 minutes later, 3 explosions tear through Awa Maru's hull in rapid succession. The first torpedo strikes amidships, rupturing fuel tanks and sending a geyser of flame into the night sky. The second hits near the engine room, killing Chief Engineer Tanaka instantly and flooding the compartment with scalding steam. The third torpedo, striking forward, buckles the ship's spine and seals her fate. Captain Hamada has just enough time to order abandon ship before Awa Maru lists heavily to starboard. She sinks in 12 minutes, taking her cargo of 8,000 tons of aviation fuel and most of her crew to the bottom of the Pacific. The few survivors cling to debris in the oil-slicked water, watching the flames die as their ship disappears beneath the waves. This scene played out over 1,000 times during World War II, yet most people have never heard this story. While the world watched dramatic dogfights over aircraft carriers and massive naval battles like Midway, America's submarines were fighting a different kind of war. A silent, methodical campaign that would ultimately strangle Japan's war machine more effectively than any other single military operation. With less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel, American submarines sank an astounding 55% of Japan's entire merchant fleet. They destroyed over 1,000 Japanese merchant ships, cutting off the flow of oil, food, and raw materials that kept the Japanese empire alive. The most shocking part? Japanese leadership never fully grasped the scale of this underwater devastation until it was far too late to stop it. This is the story of how a small force of American submarines fought the most decisive war in the Pacific, a war that remained invisible to the world but determined the fate of entire nations. It's a story of technological innovation, strategic brilliance, and individual courage that changed the course of history from beneath the waves. Japan's greatest strength was also its fatal weakness, a geographic reality that would prove more decisive than any military defeat on land or sea. As an island nation stretching across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, Japan had built one of the world's most powerful maritime empires by 1941. But this very success contained the seeds of its destruction. The Japanese archipelago, consisting of 4 main islands and thousands of smaller ones, possessed virtually no natural resources capable of sustaining a modern industrial war machine. Every drop of oil that powered Japan's war machine had to cross hundreds of miles of ocean, from conquered territories in Southeast Asia. The Dutch East Indies, seized in early 1942, provided 90% of Japan's petroleum needs through a complex network of refineries, pipelines, and tanker routes that stretched across the Indonesian archipelago. Malaya supplied crucial rubber for vehicle tires and aircraft components, along with tin needed for electronics and ammunition. The Philippines offered rice to feed Japan's growing population, and strategic minerals like chromium and manganese essential for steel production. Burma provided additional oil and served as a land bridge to potential German cooperation. Even basic food supplies had to be imported on a massive scale. Japan could only feed about 80% of its population from domestic agriculture, despite intensive farming techniques that maximized every available acre. This meant that roughly 20 million Japanese people depended on imported food to survive, creating a vulnerability that enemy strategists could exploit if they understood its implications. The Japanese merchant marine in 1941 was impressive by any standard. Over 6 million tons of shipping distributed among more than 2,500 vessels, including some of the most modern cargo ships in the world. Japanese shipbuilders had created efficient, fast merchant ships specifically designed to serve the empire's far-flung territories. These vessels incorporated advanced hull designs that maximized cargo capacity while maintaining the speed necessary to maintain tight schedules across vast Pacific distances. The Mitsui and Mitsubishi shipping lines operated regular routes that connected Tokyo to Singapore, Manila, Batavia, and dozens of smaller ports across the Pacific with clockwork precision. These weren't just cargo ships. They were the arteries of an empire, carrying everything from crude oil and coal to rice and manufactured goods in a carefully orchestrated dance of supply and demand. The efficiency of this system was remarkable. Japanese logistics experts had calculated shipping schedules down to the day, ensuring that raw materials flowed smoothly from conquered territories to Japanese factories, and finished goods moved back to support the empire's continued expansion. Specialized tanker fleets carried different grades of petroleum products, while refrigerated ships transported perishable foods across tropical waters. The system was so finely tuned that disrupting even a small portion of it could create cascading effects throughout the entire empire. Japanese naval strategists understood this vulnerability in theory, but they believed their powerful navy would protect these vital sea lanes against any conceivable threat. The combined fleet, with its massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, fast aircraft carriers, and experienced pilots, seemed invincible after the stunning success at Pearl Harbor. Japanese admirals assumed that American forces would be too busy defending their own territory to threaten Japanese shipping in any systematic way. They had studied the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic and concluded that Japan's situation was fundamentally different. Their merchant ships would operate primarily in friendly waters, protected by land-based aircraft, naval patrols, and the vast distances that separated them from American bases. The Japanese also believed that American submarines, designed primarily for operations in coastal waters, lacked the range and endurance necessary for sustained operations in the vast Pacific. They were catastrophically wrong on every count. The merchant ships that had built Japan's empire would become the targets that destroyed it, and the very system that had allowed Japan to project power across the Pacific would become the mechanism of its slow strangulation. Beneath the waves, America possessed a weapon that would prove more decisive than any battleship or bomber: the submarine force of the United States Navy, a small but technologically advanced service that would revolutionize naval warfare. In December 1941, this force consisted of just 111 submarines and approximately 13,000 officers and sailors, a force so small it could have fit into a single large stadium. This represented less than 2% of total U.S. Navy personnel, a tiny fraction compared to the massive surface fleet that included 17 battleships, 7 aircraft carriers, 37 cruisers, and over 170 destroyers. Most naval experts, both American and Japanese, viewed submarines as auxiliary weapons, useful for reconnaissance, attacking enemy warships in harbor, and perhaps disrupting enemy communications, but not capable of winning wars on their own. The prevailing naval doctrine, influenced by the theories of Alfred Thayer Mahan and the experience of World War I, emphasized decisive battles between surface fleets, with submarines playing a supporting role at best. Even submarine officers themselves often saw their primary mission as supporting the battle fleet, rather than conducting independent operations against enemy commerce. The American submarine force entered the war with serious handicaps that nearly crippled their effectiveness and almost led to their dismissal as a failed weapon system. Their primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, suffered from a defective magnetic detonator that caused torpedoes to explode prematurely, pass harmlessly under targets, or fail to detonate at all. The problem was so severe that submarine commanders reported hitting enemy ships dead-on, only to watch their torpedoes fail to explode, leaving targets undamaged and alerted to the submarine's presence. The magnetic detonator, designed to explode beneath a ship's hull and break its back, had never been properly tested under combat conditions due to peacetime budget constraints. Even worse, peacetime rules of engagement required submarines to surface and warn merchant ships before attacking, giving targets time to escape, call for help, or even ram the submarine. These restrictions reflected America's adherence to international maritime law and the London Naval Treaty, but they made submarine operations nearly suicidal in wartime conditions. The submarines themselves, while technologically advanced in many respects, were designed primarily for operations in American coastal waters and the relatively confined spaces of the Caribbean and Mediterranean, not for the vast distances and extended patrols required for Pacific warfare. Many boats lacked the range and endurance needed for operations thousands of miles from friendly bases. The crews, trained extensively in peacetime conditions, had never experienced the psychological stress of combat operations, the technical challenges of maintaining complex machinery under battle conditions, or the physical hardships of spending months submerged in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything in ways that even American naval leaders didn't immediately understand. Within hours of the Japanese strike, Admiral Chester Nimitz issued new orders to the Pacific Submarine Force that would transform them from a defensive auxiliary into an offensive weapon of unprecedented effectiveness. Execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. This single command freed American submarines from the legal and tactical constraints that had hampered them, but more importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in American naval strategy. No longer would submarines surface to warn enemy ships or distinguish between military and civilian targets. Every Japanese vessel, from battleships to fishing boats, became fair game in what would become the most ruthless and effective commerce raiding campaign in naval history. The submarine force also benefited from America's greatest secret weapon, the ability to read Japanese naval codes through the top-secret Magic Intelligence Program. Intelligence officers at Station Hypo in Hawaii intercepted and decoded Japanese radio transmissions, providing submarine commanders with precise information about enemy ship movements, routes, schedules, and even cargo manifests. This intelligence advantage transformed submarine operations from random hunting expeditions into precision strikes against high-value targets. Submarine commanders could position their boats exactly where Japanese convoys would pass, turning routine cargo runs into carefully planned ambushes. American submarines also possessed significant technological advantages that would become crucial as the war progressed and tactics evolved. Their sonar systems were more advanced than Japanese equivalents, allowing target detection at greater ranges and providing better underwater navigation capabilities. Surface radar, a technology the Japanese never fully mastered, enabled American submarines to operate effectively on the surface during nighttime hours, charging batteries and making high-speed transits while remaining undetected. Perhaps most importantly, American submarines were built with greater structural strength and damage tolerance than their Japanese counterparts, allowing them to survive depth charge attacks that would have destroyed enemy submarines. The underwater war began slowly and frustratingly, hampered by torpedo problems that nearly led to the abandonment of submarine operations entirely. But by late 1942, American submarines were finding their deadly rhythm and developing the tactics that would make them the most effective anti-shipping force in naval history. The early months of 1942 were marked by failure and frustration, as submarine after submarine reported successful attacks that resulted in no sinkings. USS Sargo fired 13 torpedoes at a Japanese aircraft carrier and scored no hits. USS Seawolf attacked a Japanese battleship at point-blank range and watched helplessly as her torpedoes failed to explode. The problem became so severe that some submarine commanders began to question their own competence, while Navy bureaucrats suggested that submarines were obsolete weapons unsuited for modern warfare. The solution came through the persistence of submarine commanders, who conducted their own field tests and discovered the multiple defects in the Mark 14 torpedo system. By late 1943, these problems had been resolved, and American submarines suddenly became devastatingly effective. USS Wahoo, under Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, became legendary for aggressive tactics that brought the war directly to Japanese home waters and revolutionized submarine warfare doctrine. Morton rejected the cautious approach favored by peacetime training and instead adopted an aggressive philosophy that treated every patrol as a hunting expedition. In January 1943, Wahoo penetrated the heavily defended Sea of Japan, considered by the Japanese to be an impregnable inland sea, and sank 4 merchant ships in a single patrol, proving that no Japanese waters were safe from submarine attack. Morton's success wasn't just tactical, it was psychological, demonstrating to other submarine commanders that aggressive action produced results while cautious approaches yielded nothing. His approach revolutionized submarine warfare throughout the Pacific Fleet. Instead of avoiding enemy escorts, Morton attacked them directly, clearing the way for strikes against merchant vessels and demonstrating that Japanese anti-submarine defenses were far weaker than assumed. His success inspired other submarine commanders to adopt similarly bold tactics, creating a new generation of aggressive submarine skippers who would terrorize Japanese shipping throughout the Pacific. The torpedo crisis finally ended in late 1943, when the Navy replaced the faulty Mark 14 detonators with reliable contact exploders and corrected the depth-running problems that had plagued the weapons since the war's beginning. Suddenly, American torpedoes worked exactly as designed, and submarine kill rates skyrocketed beyond anyone's expectations. Commanders who had endured months of frustration watching their torpedoes fail now achieved devastating success rates that exceeded their wildest dreams. USS Silverside sank 23 Japanese ships totaling over 90,000 tons, making her one of the most successful submarines in the Pacific. USS Flasher destroyed 21 vessels totaling over 100,000 tons, earning her the distinction of sinking more enemy tonnage than any other American submarine. USS Tautog claimed 26 enemy ships, more than any other American submarine, while operating primarily in the dangerous waters around Japanese home islands. These boats developed coordinated wolf-pack tactics, with multiple submarines working together to attack Japanese convoys in carefully orchestrated operations that maximize their effectiveness. Unlike German U-boats, which operated in large groups of 8 to 12 boats, American wolf packs typically consisted of 3 submarines that could coordinate attacks while maintaining the stealth and independence of action that made submarines so effective. The wolf packs used sophisticated communication procedures to share target information and coordinate simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, creating situations where Japanese convoy commanders found themselves facing attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Japanese merchant captains trained for peacetime navigation rather than wartime evasion found themselves completely unprepared for the coordinated submarine attacks that could destroy an entire convoy in a matter of hours. By 1943, the stranglehold was tightening around Japan's throat with mathematical precision, though Japanese leadership failed to recognize the mortal danger developing beneath the waves of their empire. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japanese shipyards could possibly replace them, creating a deficit that grew larger every month and would eventually prove impossible to overcome. The mathematics were brutal and inexorable. Japan lost an average of 300,000 tons of merchant shipping per month throughout 1943, while their shipyards, despite heroic efforts and round-the-clock construction schedules, could only produce about 200,000 tons monthly. This meant Japan's merchant fleet was shrinking by 100,000 tons every month, a death spiral that would eventually strangle the entire empire, as surely as a noose tightening around a victim's neck. The deficit was even worse than these raw numbers suggested, because the new ships being built were often smaller, slower, and less efficient than the modern vessels being sunk by American submarines. Japanese shipyards, forced to prioritize speed over quality, began producing simplified designs that sacrificed cargo capacity and fuel efficiency for rapid construction. Many of these hastily built ships suffered from structural defects that made them vulnerable to storm damage and mechanical failures, reducing their effective service life, even when they avoided submarine attack. The economic impact rippled through every aspect of Japanese society like a stone thrown into a still pond, creating ever-widening circles of disruption and hardship. Oil tankers carrying precious petroleum from the Dutch East Indies became priority targets for American submarines, which used intelligence intercepts to position themselves along the most heavily traveled tanker routes. By late 1943, oil shipments to Japan had dropped by 60% compared to 1942 levels, forcing Japanese industry to implement increasingly severe conservation measures. Japanese factories began shutting down production lines due to fuel shortages, starting with non-essential consumer goods and gradually affecting military production. As the crisis deepened, the Imperial Navy was forced to reduce training flights for new pilots because aviation gasoline became too precious to waste on practice missions, creating a vicious cycle that would have devastating consequences for Japanese air power. As pilot training decreased due to fuel shortages, the quality of Japanese aviators declined precipitously, making them less effective in combat and more likely to be shot down by experienced American pilots, which in turn required even more replacement pilots who couldn't be properly trained due to the same fuel shortages that had created the problem in the first place. Food shortages appeared in Japanese cities as cargo ships carrying rice from Southeast Asia fell victim to submarine attacks with increasing frequency. The Japanese government implemented strict rationing programs that reduced civilian food consumption to barely subsistence levels, but even these rationed supplies became unreliable as merchant ships failed to reach port. Civilians in major cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya began experiencing genuine hunger for the first time since the war began, with many families reducing their meals to a single bowl of rice per day, supplemented by whatever vegetables they could grow in tiny urban gardens. Black markets flourished as desperate citizens traded family heirlooms, jewelry, and precious possessions for basic foodstuffs, creating a parallel economy that the government couldn't control, despite increasingly harsh penalties for black market activity. The government's propaganda machine tried desperately to maintain civilian morale by blaming shortages on temporary disruptions caused by American bombing raids, but the reality of systematic starvation was becoming impossible to hide as malnutrition became visible in the faces of ordinary Japanese citizens. The military consequences proved even more severe than civilian hardships, as the Japanese war machine began to suffer from systematic resource starvation that affected every aspect of military operations. Japanese garrisons on isolated Pacific islands found themselves cut off from resupply, as submarines made cargo runs increasingly dangerous and eventually impossible. Troops on bypassed islands like Truk, Rabaul, and Wake began starving as supply ships stopped attempting the dangerous voyages, leaving thousands of Japanese soldiers to survive on whatever local resources they could find. The Japanese Army's planned offensive operations had to be canceled or postponed indefinitely because the fuel, ammunition, and supplies needed for major campaigns couldn't be delivered safely to forward staging areas. Even more critically, the flow of strategic materials needed for weapons production was being systematically severed, creating shortages that affected everything from rifle ammunition to aircraft engines. The years 1943 and 1944 marked the peak of American submarine effectiveness, when the underwater campaign reached its full devastating potential and began to achieve results that exceeded even the most optimistic pre-war projections. By this point, experienced submarine crews had perfected their tactics through months of combat experience. Reliable torpedoes gave them complete confidence in their weapons, and superior intelligence allowed them to position themselves with surgical precision for maximum effectiveness. The combination of these factors created a perfect storm of destruction that would prove impossible for Japan to counter or survive. The results were catastrophic for Japan and shocking even to American naval leaders who had authorized the submarine campaign. In 1944 alone, American submarines sank over 600 Japanese merchant ships, totaling more than 2.7 million tons of shipping, a figure so staggering that it represented more tonnage than Japan had built in the previous 5 years combined. To put this destruction in perspective, Japan was losing the equivalent of its entire pre-war merchant marine every 18 months, a rate of attrition that no nation could sustain indefinitely. The destruction was so systematic and thorough that American submarine commanders began running out of worthwhile targets in some areas of the Pacific, forcing them to expand their hunting grounds into previously safe Japanese waters. The Luzon Strait, the narrow waterway between the Philippines and Taiwan, became known as Convoy College among American submariners because so many Japanese ships were sunk there that it served as an advanced training ground where new crews could learn combat techniques from experienced veterans. Japanese convoys attempting to carry oil from Southeast Asia to Japan faced a gauntlet of American submarines positioned along every major shipping route, turning what should have been routine cargo runs into desperate attempts to reach safety through submarine-infested waters. The submarines used intelligence intercepts to position themselves exactly where Japanese convoys would pass, creating killing fields where merchant ships faced almost certain destruction. USS Barb, under Commander Eugene Fluckey, exemplified the aggressive and innovative tactics that made this period so deadly for Japanese shipping and demonstrated the evolution of submarine warfare beyond simple torpedo attacks. In a single patrol in early 1945, Barb sank 15 Japanese vessels using a combination of torpedoes, deck gun attacks, and even rocket fire, proving that submarines could adapt their tactics to maximize destruction while conserving their limited torpedo supply. Fluckey's innovations included using submarines to lay mines in Japanese harbors, attacking ships with deck guns to save torpedoes for high-value targets, and even landing sabotage teams on Japanese shores to destroy coastal infrastructure. His submarine became a floating laboratory for testing new tactics that other submarine commanders quickly adopted throughout the Pacific Fleet. Other submarine commanders developed equally creative and devastating tactics that pushed the boundaries of what submarines could accomplish. USS Harder became famous for hunting Japanese destroyers, the very ships designed to protect convoys from submarine attack, sinking 5 destroyers in a single patrol, and earning the nickname Destroyer Killer among both American and Japanese naval forces. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces was enormous and far-reaching. Destroyer captains became increasingly reluctant to pursue submarines aggressively, knowing they might become targets themselves, which reduced the effectiveness of Japanese anti-submarine efforts and made merchant ships even more vulnerable to attack. The human cost was staggering on both sides, but fell disproportionately on Japanese merchant sailors, who faced death rates that exceeded those of frontline combat troops. These civilian mariners, many of whom had spent their careers in peaceful commercial shipping, suddenly found themselves in the most dangerous job in the Japanese Empire. By 1944, experienced Japanese merchant officers were so scarce that ships sailed with inexperienced crews who lacked the skills, training, and knowledge necessary to evade submarine attacks or even navigate safely in wartime conditions. Many Japanese merchant ships sailed without adequate escort protection because Japan simply didn't have enough destroyers, corvettes, and patrol craft to protect all their shipping routes simultaneously. The few escort vessels available were often pulled away to support major naval operations or defend against American carrier raids, leaving merchant convoys defenseless against submarine attack during the most critical phases of their voyages. By late 1944, Japan had reached the point of no return in the submarine war, crossing a threshold beyond which recovery became impossible, regardless of any actions they might take. Though many Japanese leaders still failed to comprehend the full scope of the disaster unfolding beneath the waves, the statistics were stark and undeniable. American submarines had sunk over 1,000 Japanese merchant ships, representing 55% of Japan's entire pre-war merchant fleet. This wasn't just a military defeat or a temporary setback. It was economic strangulation on a scale unprecedented in modern warfare, a systematic destruction of a nation's ability to sustain itself that went far beyond anything achieved by conventional military operations. The remaining Japanese merchant fleet was a shadow of its former self, consisting largely of small, obsolete vessels that were barely seaworthy and completely inadequate for the massive transportation needs of a modern industrial empire. Many of these surviving ships were converted fishing boats, coastal steamers, and other vessels never designed for long-distance cargo hauling, pressed into service out of desperation rather than suitability. The oil situation had become desperate beyond Japanese leaders' worst nightmares, creating a crisis that affected every aspect of the war effort and civilian life. Petroleum imports, which had averaged 4 million barrels per month in 1942 when Japan's empire was at its peak, had dropped to less than 300,000 barrels per month by early 1945, a 92% reduction that made continued military operations virtually impossible. This catastrophic decline in oil imports meant that Japanese refineries sat idle for lack of crude oil to process, while existing fuel stocks dwindled to critically low levels that forced impossible choices between military and civilian needs. The Imperial Navy's fuel reserves, carefully hoarded throughout the war for a decisive battle that would never come, dwindled to such critically low levels that major naval operations had to be canceled, not because of enemy action, but because there simply wasn't enough fuel to power the fleet. Admiral Suemu Toyota later admitted that fuel shortages, rather than enemy naval superiority, determined Japanese naval strategy in the war's final year, forcing the once mighty combined fleet to remain in port while American forces advanced inexorably toward the Japanese home islands. Food imports had virtually ceased, creating famine conditions in Japanese cities that the government could no longer hide from the population, despite increasingly desperate propaganda efforts. The government's rationing system, already reduced to starvation levels, broke down completely as ships carrying rice and other staples from Southeast Asia failed to reach Japanese ports with any regularity. Urban populations survived on increasingly meager rations that provided barely enough calories to sustain life, while rural areas hoarded what food they could produce locally, creating a breakdown in the distribution system that had fed Japan's cities for decades. Children in Japanese cities showed visible signs of malnutrition, with many suffering from diseases associated with vitamin deficiencies and protein shortage, while adult civilians lost significant weight as the food situation deteriorated beyond the government's ability to manage. The black market price of rice increased by over 1,000% between 1943 and 1945, making basic nutrition unaffordable for many families and creating a parallel economy based on barter and desperation that the government couldn't control despite increasingly harsh penalties. Industrial production collapsed as raw materials stopped flowing from conquered territories, creating a cascade of failures that affected every aspect of Japan's war-making capacity. Japanese factories that had hummed with activity in 1942, producing everything from aircraft engines to rifle ammunition, stood silent by 1945, their machinery idle for lack of materials to process and fuel to power the production lines. The famous Zero fighter aircraft, once the terror of Pacific skies and the symbol of Japanese air superiority, could barely be produced because aluminum, steel, and other strategic materials couldn't reach Japanese factories in sufficient quantities. Aircraft production dropped from over 2,000 planes per month in 1944 to fewer than 500 per month by early 1945, and many of these aircraft were of such poor quality due to material shortages that they were barely airworthy. Even more telling, the few aircraft that were completed often couldn't fly because aviation fuel had become too scarce for anything but the most critical missions, creating a situation where Japan possessed aircraft but couldn't use them effectively. Japanese recognition of the submarine threat came too late to matter, arriving only when the damage had become irreversible and total defeat was inevitable, like a doctor's diagnosis delivered after the patient had already died. In early 1945, Emperor Hirohito himself received detailed briefings that finally laid bare the scope of the shipping disaster, briefings that had been delayed for months by military leaders who hoped to find solutions before admitting the full extent of the catastrophe to their sovereign. The numbers presented to the emperor were shocking even to Japan's leadership, who had been shielded from the worst news throughout the war by subordinates who feared to deliver bad news. Over 8 million tons of merchant shipping lost, with American submarines responsible for the vast majority of these losses. The emperor, who had been told throughout the war that Japan's merchant marine was successfully adapting to wartime conditions, was reportedly stunned by the scale of the maritime catastrophe and the systematic nature of the destruction. Admiral Nagano Osami, one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack and a strong advocate for war with America, privately admitted that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant whose submarine force was methodically destroying the empire from beneath the waves, with a thoroughness and efficiency that no one had thought possible. The Japanese high command finally understood that they were fighting a war they could not win, not because of any single dramatic battle or military defeat, but because their entire economic foundation was being systematically destroyed by an enemy they could barely see and couldn't effectively counter. Desperate countermeasures were attempted throughout 1944 and early 1945, but they came far too late to change the war's outcome, and often made the situation worse by consuming resources that could have been used more effectively elsewhere. Japan began converting passenger ships, fishing vessels, and even small coastal steamers into makeshift cargo carriers. But these improvised solutions couldn't replace the specialized tankers and bulk carriers that had been sunk, and many of these converted vessels lacked the capacity, speed, and seaworthiness necessary for long-distance cargo operations. The conversion process itself consumed precious resources, skilled labor, and time that Japan no longer had. While many of these hastily converted vessels were sunk on their first or second voyages, having been pressed into service without adequate protection, experienced crews, or proper equipment. The few remaining experienced merchant officers were spread so thin across the diminished fleet that ships sailed with dangerously inexperienced crews who often fell victim to basic navigation errors, mechanical failures, and poor seamanship, even when they managed to avoid submarine attacks. Some Japanese merchant ships were lost to storms, collisions, and equipment failures that experienced crews might have prevented, adding to the losses caused by enemy action and further reducing Japan's already inadequate shipping capacity. Japanese anti-submarine warfare efforts, never adequate to begin with due to the Navy's focus on surface fleet operations, proved completely insufficient against the scale and sophistication of the American submarine campaign. Japan had built fewer than 200 dedicated escort vessels during the entire war, while naval experts estimated they needed at least 1,000 properly equipped escorts to provide adequate protection for their shipping routes. The escorts they did have were often obsolete destroyers converted for anti-submarine duty, or hastily built corvettes and patrol craft with minimal anti-submarine equipment and inexperienced crews who lacked the training and experience necessary for effective convoy protection. Japanese sonar technology lagged years behind American developments. Their depth charges were less effective than those used by other navies, and their anti-submarine tactics were based on outdated theories that had been proven ineffective by the British experience in the Atlantic. Perhaps most importantly, Japan never developed the systematic convoy procedures and organizational methods that had allowed Britain to survive the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, instead relying on ad hoc arrangements that left merchant ships vulnerable to attack and made coordination between escorts and merchant vessels nearly impossible. The American submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping stands as one of the most decisive and cost-effective military operations in history, achieving strategic victory through the systematic destruction of an enemy's economic lifeline with a precision and thoroughness that had never been seen before in naval warfare. The final statistics tell a story of unprecedented maritime destruction that changed the nature of naval warfare forever. American submarines sank 1,814 Japanese merchant ships totaling 5.3 million tons, representing 55% of Japan's entire merchant fleet, and effectively destroying the transportation network that had built and sustained the Japanese empire. Additionally, they sank 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 11 cruisers, and numerous destroyers and submarines, proving that submarines could engage and defeat surface warships as well as merchant vessels. These numbers become even more remarkable when considering the tiny force that achieved them. Never more than 150 American submarines operated in the Pacific at any given time, manned by fewer than 16,000 officers and sailors, a force smaller than a single Army division, but with strategic impact, far exceeding that of entire Army groups. The cost-effectiveness of the submarine campaign was extraordinary by any measure. Each submarine represented an investment of approximately $6 million in 1940s dollars, while the cargo ships they sank often carried cargoes worth many times that amount, and the strategic materials and fuel they prevented from reaching Japan were literally irreplaceable. The human cost was severe on both sides, with 52 American submarines lost during the war, and approximately 3,500 American submariners killed in action, representing a casualty rate of about 22%, the highest of any branch of the U.S. military during World War II. This casualty rate reflected the dangerous nature of submarine operations, where detection by enemy forces almost invariably meant death for the entire crew, and where mechanical failures or navigation errors could prove just as fatal as enemy action. Japanese losses were far higher in both absolute and proportional terms, with an estimated 116,000 merchant sailors and naval personnel killed by submarine attack, representing a significant portion of Japan's trained maritime workforce. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese merchant sailors was devastating and long-lasting. Many refused to sail on dangerous routes even when threatened with military punishment, while others suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, making them ineffective even when they continued to serve. The submarine campaign's strategic impact extended far beyond simple ship counts and tonnage figures, demonstrating principles of economic warfare that would influence military thinking for decades to come. By cutting Japan's maritime supply lines with surgical precision, American submarines forced the Japanese Empire into a death spiral of resource depletion that made continued resistance impossible regardless of Japan's military capabilities or the courage of its soldiers. The campaign demonstrated that modern industrial nations, regardless of their military prowess or technological sophistication, remain fundamentally vulnerable to attacks on their economic infrastructure, a lesson that influenced Cold War naval strategy and continues to shape military planning today. This lesson led both superpowers to develop large submarine fleets capable of disrupting enemy commerce, while also spurring the development of anti-submarine warfare capabilities designed to protect vital shipping routes. The success of the Pacific submarine campaign also validated the concept of economic warfare, the idea that destroying an enemy's ability to sustain military operations could be more effective than directly attacking military forces, a concept that would become central to strategic thinking in the nuclear age. The courage and skill of American submarine crews, operating in the most dangerous and isolated conditions of the war, deserves recognition alongside the more famous exploits of fighter pilots, bomber crews, and infantry units, whose stories have been told more frequently. These men fought a lonely war beneath the waves, often spending months at sea in cramped, dangerous conditions, where the slightest mechanical failure or tactical error could mean death for the entire crew. They operated in enemy waters thousands of miles from friendly bases, with no possibility of rescue if their submarines were damaged or sunk, and no support except what they could provide for each other. Their silent service achieved what massive bombing campaigns and huge naval battles could not: the complete economic strangulation of a major industrial power through the systematic destruction of its maritime lifelines. The technological innovations developed during the submarine campaign, from improved sonar systems and radar equipment to advanced torpedo designs and fire control systems, influenced naval warfare for decades to come and laid the foundation for the nuclear submarine fleets that would dominate the oceans during the Cold War. The intelligence techniques used to track enemy shipping, decode communications, and coordinate submarine operations became the foundation for modern naval intelligence operations and demonstrated the crucial importance of information warfare in modern military operations. Today, as nations again depend on global shipping for their economic survival and prosperity, the lessons of the Pacific submarine campaign remain starkly relevant, reminding us that the most decisive battles are sometimes fought not in the sky or on land, but in the dark depths beneath the waves where silent hunters can strangle entire empires without firing a single shot at their armies or bombing a single city. The silent service that strangled the Japanese Empire demonstrated that in modern warfare, economic vulnerability can be more critical than military strength, and that small, highly trained forces using advanced technology and superior intelligence can achieve strategic effects far beyond their apparent size and cost, changing the course of history through patience, skill, and the relentless application of force against an enemy's most vulnerable points.